So I'm delighted that today we have Bob Wildfong and Allison Eady with us. Am I pronouncing that right, Allison? Yes, okay. I'll read their bios for you here, and it's also on our course website. So Bob Wildfong is the Executive Director of Seeds of Diversity, which is a national organization of farmers and gardeners who preserve food biodiversity by seed saving and by protecting pollinators. He's also a partner in the Bauta Family Initiative on Canadian Seed Security, which supports farmers to increase the quality and quantity and diversity of Canada's domestic seed supply. So we look forward to hearing more about that. And Allison Eady, who will speak second today, joined Seeds of Diversity in 2019 to help grow the School Food Gardens program. And she's also a PhD candidate in community psychology at Wilfrid Laurier University, and is focusing her PhD research in part on this school food garden program. So we'll turn it over to you, Bob, first, and we can probably have a few questions in between the two presentations and then more wholesome discussion towards the end. So thank you so much for being here. I will give you the powers. I'll make you a co-host. I don't know if you need that in order to share your screen, but just in case.
There, I think that worked. So
Great.
I'm going to talk about the biodiversity that's in our food system and how we're working in Canada, and more specifically in this region, to build more security into our seed system. We talk about seed security as a kind of a version of food security. So if we think of food security being in general the ability of people to be able to get the food that they need, and for the system that provides our food to be resilient to changes that come along and to be sustainable in the long term, that's food security. And part of that is the need for people to be able to get the seeds that they need in order to grow that food, and for the system that provides seeds to be secure and sustainable in the long term. So when we talk about seed security, just substitute the word seed for food, and all the concepts of food security apply to seeds as well. And I'll end up talking about some more specific ways that we develop seed security. Participatory plant breeding is a kind of a novel partnership between conventional plant breeders and farmers. And I'll get into that in more detail, but the basic idea is that plant breeders and farmers are similar in some ways, but they have different skill sets. And if you put them together, you get better results than if you do plant breeding just by one or the other. So getting into what we mean by food biodiversity, this is an example. Think of this circle as being all the different kinds of food, all the different crops that you could get 100 years ago. We think about 100 years ago in Canada, you could find about 35,000 different kinds of food plants. There were many, many kinds of tomatoes and apples and beans and wheat, and all the crops you can think of. A lot of diversity of different kinds of plants, but we don't have that anymore. What's happened in the last 100 years is 3/4 of all of our food diversity worldwide has become extinct. The kind of basic reason for this is, you can imagine 100 years ago, people were saving their own seeds. People in a particular community would have their own particular kinds of seeds, their own kinds of wheat or apples or beans that they grew in that community. And then in the next community, there would be farmers with a different kind of bean or a different kind of apple. Maybe that was suited to the weather there, the soil there, the altitude. These all affect how different crops grow, and so it's kind of nice to have the right kinds of crops for the right place. And that's kind of how we had come to an equilibrium across the country. Different regions had different kinds of crops, and they made their own seeds because they saved seeds from their own fields. Then when we became more of a mass market kind of seed supply, so that people were purchasing their seeds from big scale seed dealers, then people in the prairies and people on the East Coast might be growing the same crops. And that doesn't really make sense to have the same varieties of crops being grown all across the country, but that's kind of how it turned out to be, because there are economies in the seed industry that make that it's good for the seed companies, not so good for the seed system in general and the food system in general. Because people weren't saving their own seeds, many varieties just weren't grown, they weren't propagated, and they disappeared because nobody was growing them. And so now we have about a quarter of all that food diversity left. And when we look at that closely, we find out that this little green sliver, that's how much you can actually buy. Okay, out of the 1/4 of our food diversity that we have left, you can get about 1/10 of it. The other 90% is locked away in seed banks, or it's being grown by a few collectors, but you probably can't get those seeds. So we're really depending, our whole food system depending on 1/40th of the crop diversity that existed 100 years ago. And that's not a very safe place to be. So where is that other 90%? And many people will recognize this picture here. This is the global seed vault, sometimes called the Doomsday Seed Vault. It's basically an old mine shaft in a mountain on a little island way up in the Arctic Circle, north of Norway. And inside that mine shaft, they made a seed vault. And all of the seed banks in the world have backed up their seeds and put them into this very cold place. It's very, very remote, difficult to get to, and nothing ever happens there. It's very politically stable. Unlike some parts of the world, it's very geologically stable. Unlike some parts of the world, there's never any sort of wildfire or tornado or anything that happens here. The worst that can happen is a polar bear might get at somebody working there. And so it's a really safe place to put stuff. We've backed up the whole world's supply of seeds in this mountain, way up in the Arctic Circle, north of Norway, to keep the seeds safe. And right now it has about 1 million samples of crop seeds. Closer to home, in Canada, we have a seed bank at the University of Saskatchewan that keeps about 100,000 samples of seeds. It's a great big freezer that's in a bunker underneath a building at the University of Saskatchewan. It's in Saskatoon. And here's where the Canadian government stores Canada's supply of seed varieties. Each of these little paper envelopes is a different kind of seed. So they don't have very much, right? They only have maybe 100 grams of each kind of seed, but the diversity there is quite substantial. And then we have everybody else who's saving seeds. And there are thousands of people all across the country who are collecting seeds, saving them, growing them again, sharing them around. And we have networks of people who are exchanging these rare seeds. So that's where the other 90% of our seed diversity is. It's in these great big seed banks, and it's in the hands of people who are saving those seeds, but it's not in seed companies. So how do we increase the security of our seed system? How do we increase the access people have to all that food biodiversity? I mean, if everybody could get all the seeds that we still have, it would increase our access to diversity 10 times, because only 1/10 of it is in the seed companies. So the way we do that is we try to connect these different seed collections. We have individual seed collections. Here's Rachel. She has a favorite tomato that you can't buy. You can't buy the seeds for these orange tomatoes. It's a family heirloom tomato. She saves the seeds. Wouldn't it be great to be able to get some of those backed up in a seed bank so future generations would be able to have them if Rachel suddenly loses her tomato crop because of a storm or a disease, or who knows, maybe she has to move and loses the seeds. We would like to back those seeds up. So Seeds of Diversity is the organization I work for. One of the things we do is we help people to collect up those kinds of food crops that are not backed up in seed banks and get them into the seed banks. So then we feel safe, right? Okay, so we backed up our seeds, we put them in seed banks, now they're up in frozen storage somewhere in the Arctic Circle. But what good does that do to you? Do you have access to those seeds? No, you don't, because you can't get them from those seed banks. They only have these little tiny paper envelopes. They have many kinds, but only small amounts. So the other thing we do is we try to get seeds out of the seed banks. Since they're small amounts, just 100 grams, little tiny paper envelope, you can't order seeds from those seed banks like a seed company. They just don't have enough to supply to people. But Seeds of Diversity can get little samples and then grow more, multiply them, and then make those available to other people. So we're getting seeds backed up to keep them safe. We're getting seeds out of the seed banks to keep them accessible. And then we're sharing them around so that they become available to growers, farmers, gardeners, anybody who wants to grow them. And that increases the diversity of seeds that are available to everybody. And that increases our food security because it means we have more choices of what to grow. That means we have more room for adapting to change. When climate change happens, when supply chain problems happen, or all kinds of things going on right now that affect our food system, the way we deal with that is by having lots of options, lots of choices of how we can change the way we do things. And that's what diversity is all about. We want to have lots of different kinds of seeds. This is one of the ways we do that. So here's another shot of the global seed bank. And this is what many people will think about. If you talk about seed banks, the average person will think about this because we've all seen this picture in magazines and newspapers and stuff. It's a well-known seed bank, and a lot of people think there's just one seed bank in the whole world, and in fact there are thousands. But this is the one that is the backup of all the backups. It's the grandmother seed bank that takes care of all the other ones. But this is also a seed bank. This is a little seed collection made by a woman in BC. She's been collecting seeds since she was a teenager. And she's now, I think, something like 75 years old. So her whole life, been collecting seeds and sharing them with people. And she's been sharing her seeds with people all over the country. Now, is this seed bank safe? And it's not quite like this seed bank. This seed bank is really safe because it's far away from everything, and it's super reinforced, and there's fire suppression systems built into the whole thing. It just keeps lots of seeds all in one place in a really secure facility. This is not a secure facility, but this seed collection actually was completely lost and then replaced. It's located, or was located, in a town called Lytton in BC. And if that name rings a bell, it's because that's the town that was destroyed by a wildfire in July. Okay, this July, the town of Lytton was completely destroyed by wildfire. And our friend who does the seed collection got out, but her seed collection did not. But what's happening right now is all the people she shared seeds with are sending their seeds back to her. And so she's actually reassembling her collection in just a matter of a few months, because it was not in just one place. It was in lots of different places, shared out among lots of people. So it's a really secure seed collection. There's like nothing, no natural disaster that could affect it because it's spread out among so many different people in so many different places. And that's how we envision the connection that we make between seed savers who are collecting seeds in their communities and seed banks that are kind of a backup. It's a very different kind of model, but when you combine the two, you get wide public access on the one side, and you get very secure one location kind of security in the other. And if the seeds are being transferred back and forth across, then you get the combination of high security and broad public access. That's our goal. So, and this is a local initiative. This is Seeds of Diversity seed collection. If you've ever been in Uptown Waterloo and you notice the big building with a clock tower on it, that's an old post office. I think it's empty right now. But right next to that is a long row building. It's an apartment building, sort of a red brick, old style kind of apartment kind of building. But you won't know that on the main floor of that are some offices. One of those has a seed collection in it. We have about 7,000 little packages of seeds in a closet, just packed into jars like this. And that is Seeds of Diversity's central collection of seeds. But we don't keep all our seeds in that closet. that closet is there just for us to be sending seeds out to people and receiving seeds from people. And we have a network of about 1,000 seed growers all across Canada who are saving seeds every year, distributing them in their communities, sending them back to Waterloo, where we inventory them and then send them out to other people to grow. So this network is really a seed collection that works in a kind of a hybrid way. We're connecting this with individual seed growers, we're connecting it with the seed banks for that kind of long-term backup, and we're also keeping this sort of in-between seed collection that can be distributed both ways. And that's how Seeds of Diversity as a nonprofit improves the seed security and the access to food biodiversity for lots of people, because we're making this bridge between the seed banks and the people. Is this a seed bank? It is. This is a seed bank too, because so far we've just looked at pictures of seeds, and that's not the point, right? The point is the food that you grow from the seeds. But our food makes seeds, right? And the seed makes food. And so I like to think of it this way, that we often think of it, this picture, this is the natural form of our food. And this food makes seeds so that then we can make more food, right? But if you think of it from a seed banker's point of view, the seeds are the main thing. And this is just the seeds way of making more seeds. So we use this to make more seeds. And this is like the intermediate stage for what we're really after. But you can think of it both ways. All the different kinds of plants in this field represent a different kind of food crop. And so having the seeds actually growing, that is part and parcel of running a seed bank too. And so we're able to get farmers to do both of those things. And I'll look at more examples of that later. When we get into this other kind of hybrid combination of how do we develop greater resilience in our food system and greater resilience in our seed system by combining what happens on the ground at farms and what happens in, say, universities with plant breeders. Participatory plant breeding is a combination of the skills of plant breeders and the experience of farmers working together. So here we have some people here. This is what plant breeders look like. Plant breeders are some of my favorite people. They're super plant nerds. Plant breeders are people who will look at plants and see things that you will never know to even look for. Little tiny characteristics and very precise details. And they're trying to find plants that have just exactly the right characteristics to make a better harvest, maybe to make a better tasting harvest or to make a more nutritious harvest. Maybe there's an agricultural problem, like a pest or a disease or a weather issue, and they're trying to find plants that have some resistance to those problems. It takes a lot of observation, and that's the key to good plant breeding. You have to look at lots of plants and observe them very carefully, and then find the exact plants that have exactly what you need and use them as your seed source for the next generation. That's what plant breeding is. Here's Ann Kirk. She's a PhD in plant breeding. This is actually taken at the University of Manitoba, an experimental farm in Manitoba. You can tell because the horizon is totally flat. And she's an expert plant breeder and makes her living by observing plants and finding just exactly the right ones. And that's how plant breeding has worked for the last century. We've gotten people with very deep education in plant anatomy to do our plant breeding for us, in the same way that we get people with very, very detailed engineering ability to make our phones for us. We don't make our own phones. We get people to do that because they've learned how to do that. Plant breeders are like that. They're very, very technical. But these are also plant breeders. This is a bunch of farmers, and they don't have PhDs, and they don't have any particular education in plant anatomy or plant physiology. What they do have is many, many years of experience in growing the plants that they grow. So they're here right now looking through a row of tomatoes and trying to find the exact tomatoes that they like best. And they're not looking for any particular kind of molecular physiology or particular kind of anatomical characteristic. They're looking for the tomatoes that look best, just their kind of gut feeling. And this is an experiment that we've done over and over to find out whether that is as good a way to breed plants as the professional plant breeders. Well, I'll tell you the answer later. So they're learning how to observe in this session here. They're learning how to look at a tomato and how to evaluate what they think is the best tomato there, but they're not using very technical means. They're looking at sort of, do you like the shape? Do you like the flavor? Do you like the way it grows? Does it seem productive? Those kinds of things, because out in the field, when you're looking at plants, those are the things you have going for you. What do you feel about it? What do you like about it? And when you look at this, these are oats. It probably doesn't look like very much. When a plant breeder or a farmer looks at this, they see all kinds of things that I don't see. I don't even know what I'm looking at. I think they're oats, right? But someone who grows oats has a real affinity for so many details because they've seen it so often and they've worked with it so much. These are potatoes. If you grow potato plants, then you will be able to see things in this field that the average person can't see. And here's something that a farmer would see that a plant breeder might not see. This is a field just about, say about this time of year when there's been a light frost. There are two different kinds of potatoes here, and the one on the left has survived the frost and the one on the right has not survived the frost. So a farmer would see this and would say, hey, this variety is more frost resistant than the other one. And the plant breeder probably wouldn't ever see that because, well, there just aren't that many plant breeders around compared to the number of farmers. So it's much more likely that a farmer would happen to see this. And the other thing is once the farmer sees this, they might say, okay, I'm going to buy that kind of potato from now on, but they wouldn't ever have the opportunity to communicate that observation to the people who are producing new varieties of potatoes, the potato plant breeders. So they're disconnected, and this kind of observation, this kind of really important thing, would not get communicated to the people who can use it. So our program, we call it participatory plant breeding, is we match up a plant breeder, that's the guy with the hat, with a farmer. It's kind of funny because the farmers are usually the ones wearing the hats, but they have a really similar outlook on what they want to achieve. They want to produce better crops that are higher yielding, that are more resilient to change, that have a better resistance to things like diseases or weather conditions. And this is a really important thing. We're doing this all across the country. This actually is in a field in Guelph. We have oats on the left and wheat on the right. And these guys are talking for hours about these very tiny details about wheat. It's really hard to stand there and watch them because they go on and on and on about all of these things that they see, which you have no idea what they're looking at. But whatever it is, it's important for us because it makes our food in the long run. And they taste, these are potatoes. Actually, they've harvested a bunch of different kinds of potatoes and they're tasting them. We got some chefs to come in and help us do the tasting. And from all of this, we managed to select varieties of wheat and oats and potatoes that were produced by the plant breeders, but evaluated by the farmers. And the farmers kind of basically their gut feeling. There's a lot of stuff here, but just look at the top and the bottom part. The top part says that the farmer selected populations are better adapted to organic crop production than conventionally selected varieties. The translation of that is that the plants that the farmers chose as the best varieties to carry on forward, that they walked through the field and they said that wheat plant is better than the other ones, that potato is better than the other ones. Those selections made by the farmers turned out to be better than the selections made by the plant breeders. And the bottom line, farmers are really good plant breeders. We've realized, and this is still a kind of a surprising thing in the industry, that we can count on farmers to do plant breeding. When you think about it, sure, of course, farmers have a very, very attuned sense of what makes a good plant. When they see it, they know it. And so we have that really good sense from farmers, combined with the technical ability and the connections. You know, not to discount the ability of plant breeders to do the same kinds of things. They have a serious amount of education in some of the finer points and access to testing and the kinds of seed bank connections that we need to make this whole plant breeding thing happen. By combining those two skill sets, we have the best results that we would get, better than either farmer breeding by themselves or plant breeder breeding by themselves. So these are some of the ways that we bring that kind of bridge building to the greatest effect, where we're combining what happens on the ground, seed savers, networks of seed growers, farmers and their gut instincts, and on the other side, institutional seed banks, the seed banks way up north that have facilities that we could never build, and plant breeders with lots of technical education and abilities and connections. It's the bridges. It's the connecting those two kinds of worlds that gives us the best results in both cases. And this is where all that kind of work is happening. It's centralized kind of in Ontario in the east, and there's a lot of grain work being done out west. But I'll be happy to give some more examples about what we're doing locally when we get to the question period.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, it will be exciting to hear more about what's going on locally. I just wanted to say as well that I forgot to mention in the intro that I think I met Bob 12 or more years ago. I know he's often given workshops on seed saving, and learning about how to preserve different, for home gardeners, what do you do with tomato seeds and how do you preserve all kinds of other seeds, so that you can share them and save them for future use yourself. And also around 10 or 12 years ago, when his sons were kind of young, I know that they used to grow out, I'm sure with help from Bob, a whole variety of tomatoes and to sell the seedlings. So my son and I had a tradition of going over to his place in May and picking up a dozen different kinds of tomatoes that we'd ordered from him and then planting them out in our garden. So as well as I think an apple tasting workshop as well that you've probably had down at Dune Heritage Village. So I know Bob is a real specialist in heritage apples as well. So yeah, really appreciate your the work that you've been doing over many decades. And by the way, when did Seeds of Diversity start, Bob?
It was in 1984. So very close to 40 years. Yeah,
amazing. Okay, so maybe we'll launch with Allison and hear what's going on locally with school food gardens.
So my name is Allison Eady. As Steffanie said, I am a PhD student at Wilfrid Laurier University in community psychology, and I'm also one of the program coordinators for Waterloo Region School Food Gardens. And we're a project of Seeds of Diversity. We're not a separate organization, but we run kind of a separate line of projects and activities through Seeds of Diversity. And I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle than Bob. I am an enthusiastic amateur gardener, but I have nowhere near the same training. I don't have a background in biology or horticulture. I'm a psychologist and a community organizer. And so that leads me to kind of look at and think about this work a bit differently. And I've been really grateful to bring together what I've learned from my work in previous fields to get to learn from Bob and people at Seeds of Diversity about how to bring this to youth work. So when I was putting this presentation together, obviously the first thing I wanted to tell you about was, what does Waterloo Region School Food Gardens do? And it's a really interesting time to be asking that question because we are an organization in transition. We are figuring it out as we go. We have been kind of since day one, but we're in the process of making some pretty big changes. So from 2016, when the organization started, to 2019, our main role was supporting gardens in schools. So that meant providing financial support through our garden grants program, providing educational resources, such as workshops, developing curriculum tools with Cambridge Self-Help Food Bank, which I believe Siobhan told you about, and building more resources to promote garden-based learning in schools. And then in 2020, we made a pretty big pivot, and I'll get into that later on, but we really needed to think deeply about what it is we were trying to do as an organization when we were no longer able to go into schools, meet with youth in person. And we realized at our core, what we really wanted to do, and we had been working towards, is providing flexible youth-led opportunities for especially older youth aged 13 to 18, to engage in learning about their food systems and to get involved in working towards a sustainable food system. And we started practicing and exploring how to do that both online and in person, because the world looks pretty different right now. So as a bit of a background, this is why I garden in schools. I believe gardening is a life skill. I think it's something we all should know for our lives. It's all something we should have a right to know. And it's something that a lot of people are disconnected from. Many of us, especially if you grew up in a city, don't necessarily get to see the food chain you're a part of, don't know much about the food systems you're a part of. So I think having gardens in schools is, first of all, an essential part of education. And second of all, is an opportunity for some pretty cool hands-on experiential learning. And this kind of learning is not only, a fun extra activity for everybody, but it's also a really supportive environment for students who don't learn well in traditional classrooms. There's a lot of general benefits to gardening in schools, so we'll talk a bit about the specific research behind this later on, but in general, it can help, having a garden in a school can help enhance students' well-being, it can improve their academic performance. Having access to green space in a school is an element of health promotion. And another really important part of food systems education is that right now, the average age of a Canadian farmer is 55. So there's a lot of farmers nearing retirement age, and there's not a lot of young people coming up in that system. And it's really hard to get in that system. I'm sure you guys have learned about this, but we really need to work on having young people learn about food systems and ideally join their food systems as agents of change for sustainability. And also I like gardening in schools because it's fun. So school gardens are actually not a new thing anywhere, but they're also not a particularly new thing in Waterloo Region. There's definitely a growing popularity over the last decade or so. But the picture on the left here is actually from a victory garden during World War II, where a lot of schools in the 30s and 40s had gardens to provide extra produce for neighborhoods during rationing and encourage students to grow their own food and save materials for the war effort. It's not a new thing. Schools in Waterloo Region have been operating gardens in kind of their current format for decades. And gardens operate in a lot of different kinds of schools. So there's preschools, primary schools, high schools, public schools, Catholic schools, private schools, all across the board. And these gardens look really different in their format and operation depending on the school you go to. So they're very adaptable. So some of the Waterloo Region gardens in schools are food focused, some of them are pollinator focused, some of them are built as green classrooms. Some of them are run through specific programs in schools, like the Specialist High Schools Majors program for high schools. So an example of that is Green Industries. And these are programs designed for especially students who might not have otherwise stayed in school, might not have wanted to graduate and go to university like the kind of standardized expectation is, but who might be interested in exploring trades and more hands-on activities. So in those cases, they're kind of formalized and put into the curriculum. But other gardens are run by student clubs, parents, teachers who like using them in their, say, environmental studies classes, in biology, in hospitality classes. There's a lot of different subjects they're used in, but these gardens can be started and run by a lot of different people. So I first got involved in all of this in 2015, and that was because I was hired as a consultant by the Region of Waterloo and the Community Garden Council of Waterloo Region, which is now the Community Garden Network, to perform a scan of school gardens in Waterloo Region. And what they wanted was a jurisdictional review of the school garden policies, all the policies at the national, provincial, municipal level that kind of talked about school garden policy, and some of the academic evidence supporting using gardens in schools. So we did kind of a literature review, and we also did a survey of all WRDSB schools. The only reason we did not include the Catholic Board is that we weren't actually accepting ethics applications, but we do have participating schools from the Catholic Board now. So we invited 103 schools to participate in a survey. It was sent out to every single principal in the Waterloo Region District School Board. 19 schools participated, with 40 responses overall, and 10 of the participating schools in, so 2014 was actually the time of data collection, had gardens. This wasn't all of the schools that had gardens at the time. This is of the schools that responded to us. Of the 19 schools, 10 of them already had gardens. And we also carried out interviews and focus groups with WRDSB staff and students to learn about their involvement with school gardens. So some of the background on this. Research in school gardens has traditionally been focused on two main areas. And within the past few years, it's really started to explode and look at things in a more holistic perspective. But for the most part, research on school gardens has been really focused on academic outcomes. So do school gardens as a part of learning promote better performance in schools? And using school gardens and garden-based learning is actually associated with an increased desire to learn, improved performance in subjects like environmental sciences, biology, mathematics, kind of as you would expect, but also in performance in arts and humanities. So it helps students do better in school if they can learn in a garden. There's a lot of interest from a health promotion perspective as well. So that's looking at how it addresses, gardening in schools addresses students' knowledge of nutrition, knowledge of where food comes from, and also their general physical health. And we know that school gardens increase nutritional knowledge. It increases students' consumption of fruits and vegetables, and it also increases their interest in and willingness to try new foods. And participating in school gardens also increases students' physical activity because they're outside moving around in a garden. And overall access to green space, whether or not it's a full school food garden, is also linked to decreased stress and improvements in emotional well-being. So they're pretty positive spaces for students. But what really interested me in some of the emerging literature that I was looking at, and from my conversations with teachers and students, was there were these more kind of holistic results that I was seeing coming out of these gardens. And these were really strongly motivating a lot of the staff and students to participate. So school gardens have been kind of put forward as a space for positive youth development. And that's a more general sense in students' growth, not just in terms of academic performance and health, but as citizens of their communities, having a sense of belonging to their schools, having a sense of social cohesion, wanting to volunteer and participate, feeling connections with their communities, and also potentially taking leadership roles in their communities. So another element of this is also an increased connectedness to nature in their community, particularly in schools where students are maybe in a more urban environment and don't have their own backyard gardens, or don't have, don't live on farms like some students do in Waterloo Region. And in general, there was this interest in school gardens as a space to really engage with sustainability and social and environmental justice, and as potential sites for a lot of transformative change. But at the time, this wasn't really present in the literature, and it's really just starting to emerge from it now. And another thing to note is that the majority of the research to that date and still today was really focused on more preschool and elementary school age students, and there wasn't as much available for secondary school age students. So when we talked to students and staff in Waterloo Region school gardens, we found that students and staff who participated in garden programs had overwhelmingly positive experiences. They loved these programs. And a lot of the schools that didn't have gardens participated in our project because they were really interested in starting one. But the teachers and students who were either currently running gardens or were trying to get one going found that there were a lot of challenges and barriers to getting their gardens started, to maintaining them once they had them. And so the big kind of things that weren't in place there were time. Teachers and students and all school staff are pretty overloaded. Schools are running on a pretty tight budget. Funding in general for buying the initial materials, for doing maintenance stuff, staff time, general staff support. Not that people didn't care about it, but that they were just overloaded and couldn't dedicate time to it. And also some challenges in school infrastructure. Things like the water mains in schools are not really easily designed in many places to be accessed by an outdoor hose to, someone who doesn't have a key to everything. And that can be a pretty big barrier to keeping your garden watered. So, like I said, we found there was a pretty big deal of interest in and enthusiasm for gardening in schools. And we saw this reflected in the policy documents as well. A lot of health and education policy documents talked directly about school gardens as tools for enhanced education and health. But there was a pretty big reluctance in these documents to commit resources to support building, maintaining, and learning in gardens. So there wasn't a ton of information about how you do this, what you need to know to do this. There wasn't any dedication of funding specifically, in Ontario at least. And there was very little clarity in policy and leadership. Whose permission do you need to have to do this? Who do you talk to get this done? What are the rules about how you can run a garden? So a lot of people who were interested in starting a garden didn't have a lot of clarity around where to start. And we also found that a lot of the schools who were running gardens were really disconnected from each other. There weren't a lot of chances, again, because everyone's overloaded and busy, to share experiences, talk about what they were doing, and maybe support other schools who were interested in doing the same. So I put out this report with the Region of Waterloo Public Health and the Community Garden Network, and then kind of wandered back to grad school to do my own thing. And coming out of the results of this project, Seeds of Diversity, including Bob and Jill Byers, started this kind of partnership with the Waterloo Region Community Garden Network to actually meet some of the recommendations from this report. And one of the most obvious things coming out of this was to find funding and support to help people start gardens in schools. So in 2017, they got funding from the Healthy Kids Community Challenge to build 7 new gardens in schools. And in the next year as well, they continued to apply for funding, find funding, and start gardens in schools across the region, and also offered the first annual Teachers Conference to give a chance for teachers to come together to talk about gardening in schools, what they were doing, what they'd like to be doing, how we can grow that across the region. And then in 2019, a lot of the really hard work that Jill and Bob and the others from the Community Garden Network had been doing really paid off. And they were awarded a 3-year Trillium Foundation Grow Grant to expand the program. And lucky me, as Jill needed to take a step back at that time, that's when I got to wander back into this incredibly formed project. So I started in the summer of 2019. And the project at this stage was committed to building up to 45 new school gardens, so 15 gardens per year through our garden grant, purchasing indoor tower gardens for 9 schools. So those are movable gardens that can be lit indoors and can be shared across the school, intended for either schools that want to keep gardening going over the winter or for schools that might not have the infrastructure to build outside. We were committed to continuing the annual educators conference. We launched that summer a youth food farmers market where our youth volunteers collected produce from gardens across the region, specifically from schools and donated by teachers, to sell at an outdoor market that was very generously hosted by Seven Shores Cafe on Regina Street. We were committed to offering food-focused workshops in schools, and we were working with Cambridge Self-Help Food Bank to develop some school food curriculum resources. So activities and different resources for teachers to be able to pick up and use to teach in gardens or teach about food in schools. And then 2020 happened. So a lot of things were already delayed because of the labor disputes in 2019. It feels like forever ago, but I don't know if you remember, there were a lot of walkouts and lockouts and strikes because teachers were in the process of negotiating their contracts and their needs weren't being met. So we had a lot of schools that were not running extracurriculars and where teachers didn't want to potentially cross a picket line to build a garden. So a lot of our builds were kind of being delayed. And we'd also found that because of the work being done over the past few years, the competition wasn't quite as tight for our garden grants. We weren't being flooded with applications, whether that was because we had already built so many gardens, whether it was because there were, challenges in actually committing to building a garden this year. So in March 2020, we just closed our 2020 grant competition, and we were kind of starting to build our plan for spring workshops, our teachers conference, and then everything stopped. And we were kind of left with the question, what do we do? We're an organization that works predominantly on site, that does really physical in-person building and activities. So do we just shut down until we can work in person again? And if we decide to stay open, what can we actually do? We decided to stay open. We wanted to keep our staff. We wanted to do what we could to provide some sort of connection to nature and gardens for students, even if they couldn't be at school in person. So we kind of had to pivot as an organization. We suddenly had a lot of time to consider some of the questions we'd been kind of avoiding. So are we only about building gardens in schools? Is that our primary area of work? And in that case, what happens when every school has a garden? Like I said, there's 103 public schools, and we had built at this point almost 30. So really, what is our core mission as an organization? And another question we've been asking ourselves is, who is our target audience? So for the grant program and for a lot of our educational resources, that was teachers. Sometimes it was parents. When we looked at our social media, which was pretty stagnant at the time, the people engaging with us were parents and teachers, and even not a lot of them. So how do we expand our reach? And what we decided to do is take a look at that gap in resources for older youth. So who are the youth we are trying to engage? And there was a pretty big gap in what was available for the youth who are actually able to engage themselves online. Obviously, a lot of primary school age kids, although that's changing, don't have their own computers or devices to access the internet, have a little bit less freedom in going online. But the students who are online and who are at the time pretty bored and looking for opportunities to engage were generally students aged 13 to 18. So the first thing we did with all of our free time all of a sudden was to build an online youth portal. So that started out as a way to share some of the information we already had online in a different, creative, more engaging way aimed specifically at youth. We realized our website looked like it was targeted for adults. It looked like it was targeted for funders and parents and teachers. So if we wanted to make it friendly and usable for youth, we had to think about how to engage them. The other thing we took a look at was our social media. So if this is the main way that nonprofits and everybody else is engaging right now, who are we engaging and who aren't we engaging? And if we're interested in engaging older youth and providing them opportunities to connect, how do we do that? So we spent a lot of 2020 doing outreach and research. So we talked to teachers, we talked to other programs who were doing similar things. We definitely picked the brains of my coworkers' younger siblings who were in high school. They have been great contributors to this. And we started to focus on building a youth engagement program that we kind of started to pilot in 2021. So again, we saw this big gap in engagement opportunities, particularly during 2020 when there were no in-person extracurriculars for youth beyond elementary school age. So we were thinking about, how do we engage these older youth? And we decided to start up a volunteer program, partly because we had some things that we were trying to do as part of a transition with this organization. And most of the year, Waterloo Region School Food Gardens is me and Raina. There's 2 to 3 of us working with a total of about 40 hours to get all of this done. So we were looking for other people to help out and help us build our online activities and give us feedback on how we could involve them. So we started to seek out volunteers to help us, review our youth portal, take a look at it. Is it engaging to you? Is it interesting to you? What could we do to make it more interesting? And we also started exploring ways to give the youth that we were connecting with their own voice on this platform. So we started a youth-led blog where our secondary school age students post blogs about whatever topics related to food and sustainability that interest them. And we also started letting our youth volunteers do social media takeovers, where they would pick a day where they were in charge of our social media content for the day. As soon as we started putting out these opportunities, we were really quickly overwhelmed with volunteers. We identified the gap and it was definitely there. So then all of a sudden we had all these people wanting to help, and we hadn't really identified that many concrete roles yet. We were really new to this. So we started thinking a bit more deeply about what we could do to create meaningful volunteer and engagement opportunities for them. So this is, again, when we check back in with our goals. We started out wanting to give youth a chance to garden and incorporate food systems learning in schools. And given that they weren't physically at schools and that learning in schools was pretty challenging at the time, we kind of pivoted and also expanded our goals. So what we were really looking to do was connect youth with their food systems, regardless of where they're learning. We knew that we had information that youth might want, and we also really wanted them to see a place for themselves in sustainability and food systems work as they kind of gained independence as secondary school students exploring the world for themselves. And we really didn't know what we were doing. We're not teenagers, so we figured out that the best way to find out was to ask some youth. So one of the kind of core principles of community engagement is that it's pretty hard to engage with community if you don't talk to them, if you don't ask them how to engage, if you don't learn about and build relationships with the communities you are working with. This is where some of my background in psychology and community organizing comes in. So we knew we needed to get youth involved and get their advice on our programs. And when we reached out through secondary school volunteer hours platforms, we found there were an incredible number of youth volunteers looking for places to engage that had a ton of ideas and energy to contribute. We just had to find the right people to ask. It took a while to get there. And now all of our programs to date pretty much are built around the idea that the youth lead and we support. So here's a bit of what that looks like. In our 2021 Youth on Online engagement that we really started just in January of this past year, we started with a few kind of key ideas for where we could be exploring youth engagement. So we had our youth food blog. We had our social media takeovers. We had our youth portal consultants. We also launched a youth and food systems interview series that was also part of a request from a funder to get youth in conversation with people working in the food system to figure out how they might want to do future work in food systems. A lot of us don't know about the wide variety of careers that you can have in food systems, and it's kind of hard to know until you meet someone in that position. So we brought in a group of youth to interview people working in areas across the food system. And this is actually a bit of a sneak peek in the bottom right-hand corner there because we are launching this in November. We've just finished editing our first 6 interviews, and we're going to be posting those on our YouTube soon. And we also started playing with the idea, since things were starting to open up a little bit, about bringing back our youth food market. So in 2021, what we ended up doing was having a really cool hybrid of engagement in our programs. We spent 2020 and early 2021 kind of building our online presence, slowly expanding our social media, working with the youth who were volunteering with us to figure out what was compelling, what was engaging, what did they want to see there, and then gradually letting them take more control over these things. And as the world opened up, we started to try to build some safe outdoor opportunities for youth to get involved. So one of the cool things about doing this work online was that we were no longer restricted to just Waterloo Region, and we ended up with youth volunteers from actually across the province. But we did have local volunteers, and we did want to keep some of that local element going. So when it came time to start planning our youth food farmers market, what we did was build an online team to take on different elements. So we let the youth lead the procurement of produce, so contacting different farms, figuring out what different gardens we had access to that we could plant, figuring out costing of produce, figuring out the logistics of the day, getting things to and from the market, what kind of things we wanted to have available. And then we also paired this with in-person opportunities. So we had a few schools donate their garden space to us for the summer, where we could plant whatever we wanted, and whatever was left would go to the students in the fall. So we had our online volunteers plan the market gardens. What are we going to plant this year? And then anyone who was available could actually show up and plant and garden with us. And there were also opportunities to harvest with us at some of our partner farms, to reach out to local businesses who might want to donate produce, and of course, to actually come to our market day, again at Seven Shores Cafe, and actually staff and implement the market. And we had volunteers coming in from Collingwood, Toronto, Mississauga, as well as Waterloo Region. So we've had a pretty great year experimenting with youth engagement in food systems, and we found some kind of new ways to look beyond just building gardens in schools to engage youth with food systems. And one of the big things we found that we kind of already knew was that there's a lot of really great youth out there looking for ways to get involved. If you want to get youth involved in your programs, but you're not sure how, what you have to do is consult with youth. Youth really know a lot about how they learn and engage. And if you give them space, they're usually pretty happy to tell you about it. One of the things that we found was really important and that was kind of reported back to us by our youth was that creating an environment where they feel welcome, where they feel like they know us, where they feel supported and that their ideas are important. So we did that by having individual meetings with every incoming volunteer, by having regular meetings with our different market and volunteer teams, by checking in with them over email, being available to answer any questions, and really validating that their ideas were important. We made room for inquiry and experimentation. So a lot of youth just getting started in volunteering and doing kind of food systems work often, haven't had a lot of experience in situations where they get to be in charge, where they get to fully decide what they want to do. And it can be really easy to fall back on kind of structures of authority. So we had a lot of students who wanted to volunteer, but in the beginning, they were really kind of like, just tell me what to do. And it took some practice with us to really find ways to communicate that this is free, this is open for you. We're here to support you in your learning. We'll guide you in the right direction. We'll help you, if you're interested in writing a blog about a topic, we can point you to some sources. We can give you feedback on your writing, but we're not going to tell you what to do. And the other thing that was really important for building confidence and also building trust was really following through on the youth's ideas and suggestions. So we did not shoot people down. Even when we had some blog topic ideas that were kind of controversial, we had a conversation about it. We said, we're not going to not let you post this, but we'd like to talk about, here's how I would go about doing this. How do you feel about that? When we had some planting ideas, like planting potatoes in June for a market in July and August, that wasn't the most realistic. We did it anyways. We said, let's plant some other things and let's see how the potatoes grow. If they don't work, then they'll be available in the fall for the other students. And the main feedback that we got from our youth volunteers was that the most effective programs that they've participated in and the most effective of our programs were the ones where they really got to see the outcomes of their work. So where they got to see all of the blog posts going up, when they got to see their posts highlighted on our social media, when they saw the gardens they were planting, when they saw the full market day. So really seeing when things were real and happening in the real world and the impact they were having was really valuable to them. So in our past kind of 3 years of funding, here's the results that we've been tracking. We've had 35 gardens built in our first few years. That's definitely slowed down over the past couple of years, but we're still interested in kind of keeping that going when we can. We've created our online youth portal and we're in the process of revising it with our youth volunteers. Our youth food blog currently posts 3 times a week and is pre-scheduled up until January. Our youth food farmers market ran twice this summer and raised more than $500 across the 2 markets. And our process of kind of experimentation and youth engagement led us to recruit about 100 youth volunteers over the course of the past year. Not even a full year, this is since January. And we actually have more than 70 youth on a waiting list to join us. We just are at a point where we don't have enough staff to really provide meaningful and well-supported opportunities. So we're waiting to either kind of gain more funding to get more staff to support this, or for some of our youth to kind of get busy and maybe move into a smaller role. So now that we've kind of tried out this pilot program, we're in the process of doing a more detailed evaluation. So all of our volunteers are asked to complete entry and exit surveys. And that includes kind of demographic factors. It includes what specific programs they're participating in, and also a measure of environmental activism and engagement that we're interested to see whether there's any change in their environmental beliefs and behaviors pre and post volunteering with us. And we're also conducting exit interviews with all of our volunteers to kind of get in their own words what their experiences were like, what we might want to work on, what we should keep doing. We're using these initial results to apply for more funding to ideally keep our programs going and expand if we can. And one of the big next things we'd like to do is build a formal youth advisory board to really have even more formalized youth guidance in our program and make it built into the structure as an organization that the youth lead. So thanks for listening to my kind of rambly in-process presentation about school food gardens in Waterloo Region. Do you have any questions for me?
Amazing, Allison. That's so exciting, especially just the emergent kind of opportunities and pivoting. And yeah, I feel like we should turn it over to younger folks in this group here to provide their reactions and ideas. David?
I had a question for you. We're doing a project where we're making a children's book, but we're also having a website that we were wanting to target to the parents and children. What did you look into, or what was your basis for figuring out how to make a child-friendly or one that was more adapted to youth website compared to what you'd said was more of an adult style? So what did you do to, yeah, those are that's my question.
Yeah, it's kind of a tricky process. There's people who are professionals in developing this kind of educational technology, and we cannot afford them. So our website was initially built by a graphic designer, and it's the kind of core website of the School of Food Gardens page is beautiful, but it's kind of dark, subdued colors and very kind of more of a grown-up aesthetic. It's not as cheerful. It doesn't feel as youth focused. There's kind of an energy you can feel to it. And also the language isn't necessarily written at a grade level that would be accessible to more youth. So one of the things that we found was key is figuring out exactly what age group you want to target. Because if you want to be working with really young kids, you've got to figure out kind of literacy levels. You've got to figure out what kind of visuals are more appealing for them, especially if you're going to be using pictures of kids. You usually want to try and use pictures of kids of the age that you're trying to engage, because if parents and really young kids see pictures of teenagers, they might not see themselves reflected and they might not think it's for them. And if teenagers see pictures of little kids, they might look at things as if it's for their younger siblings or for young kids and like it's not for them. So really figuring out who exactly you're trying to reach with it, and what's accessible to them and what's engaging to them. And one of the main ways we did that was kind of taking a look at what was out there. What are other websites that do get a lot of traffic, that are kind of have popular engagement programs that we know work with youth of different ages. We kind of modeled our process of what they did, but our youth portal was built entirely by our summer student staff. So it was really an experimental process, and it's definitely a work in progress. That helps. We're still figuring it out.
Yeah, no, thank you. That definitely helps. So I think it's more like I can take a look at your website and some other youth-based ones and take a look at those layouts. And yeah, just a reminder that the language, and I hadn't thought about it, but that's a great point about the images, that if you show little kids in there, teenagers are going to be turned off. And so I think that that's very helpful. Thank you.
I appreciated the goal that you had kind of revised, Allison, in terms of like for youth to see a place for themselves in sustainability and food systems work, right? And moving beyond gardens. Are you able to provide one or two examples of like the themes or topics that came up in the blogs? Just like what kind of surprised you in terms of what themes or issues the youth were identifying and wanting to talk about?
Absolutely. They have had an incredible variety of topics, to the point where we've actually started to have a conversation about, should we kind of rein this in to be more specifically focused on food, because that was our initial goal. But we've had topics like, starting your own garden at home. A lot of the youth were really interested in specific uses of specific plants, whether that be nutrition or like medicinal uses. We had a lot of posts on reducing waste. That was something that a lot of youth were really aware of and wanted to focus on. We also had some really interesting interest in, again, we were not trying to be, even though we have our own beliefs, we weren't trying to be political about this. We weren't trying to make youth feel like they needed to be necessarily advocates in this moment. But we had youth coming to us with like pretty strong beliefs and interests. So one of my favorite conversations I had with our bloggers, and an example of how we don't direct, was we had a student propose a blog titled, I'm trying to remember her exact wording, but why we can never have sustainability under capitalism. And I read that title and I was like, I want to talk to this person. And part of the reason I wanted to talk to this person is because up until that point, we hadn't had such strong messaging in any of our blog posts. And I didn't want to discourage her from exploring those beliefs. But the conversation we ended up having was, I kind of brought in some of what I've learned from doing communication in environmental psychology and saying, first of all, I agree, this is a great idea. But sometimes that kind of language can be intimidating or inaccessible to people. And it might mean that someone might just not read your post or dismiss it right off the bat. So if what we're looking to do is engage a new reader, you might want to consider shifting your language a little bit. So you can still say the same thing, but maybe frame it as a question and less of a statement, and invite the reader to explore this question with you. So we've been using the blog as both a chance for youth to explore their ideas and also to really build their skills as writers and communicators. But again, we let them start where they want to start and just kind of see how we can support them in getting there.
I wanted to just poll the class a little bit and see what experience, because we haven't even had a chance to talk a lot about this, like both about gardening as well as about seed saving. Does anyone have, has anyone ever saved seeds or been given seeds that have been saved from someone else that you know? Just curious to hear a few stories about that. Or Ben, maybe you wanted to jump in with a different question.
Well, yeah, I just had a question for Bob about the heirloom varieties of seeds. Like, I was just thinking, like, have farmers markets seen a shift away from like heirloom varieties too, as like farmers are growing more, I guess, of like the big seed company seeds, or does that kind of remain more constant, and then largely the varieties in grocery stores are changing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the shifts we see over the last, say, couple of decades is more diversity and not less. When I said seeds of diversity started about 40 years ago, that was because at that time, a lot of small seed companies were getting bought up by larger seed companies, and what they would do is the big company would buy a small company and then discard all of the not very top sellers. So we would see our seed diversity shrink all of a sudden, and varieties you could buy last year, you couldn't buy anymore. So that was happening in the 70s and 80s. And that's why seed saving suddenly became a thing then, because people were losing their favorite varieties or access to them. So what we've seen since then is an increase in diversity as some of those came back on the market and farmers could get them again. And I think what's more important is in the last little while, organic food has become much more of a mainstream kind of a thing. It used to be a little fragment. Now it's something you can find in all kinds of places. And picture this: 100 years ago, we had 35,000 different kinds of food that we could grow, and most people were growing more or less organically. Okay, then over that century, people stopped growing organically, focused on the varieties that could grow really well under pesticides and herbicides, and threw away a whole bunch of the other varieties that were good for organics, but they weren't doing organics, so they didn't need them. And then we went back to saying, hey, let's grow organically because we don't want to eat insecticides. And suddenly now we need all those varieties back that were really good for organic production. And so as we're bringing those kind of back out of seed banks and diversifying those sort of original genetics back again, we're finding out that they grow better under organic production than the best varieties that are made for growing with insecticides and herbicides. So you take the really good high performing varieties and grow them without the insecticides and herbicides, suddenly they're not so high performing anymore because they're kind of chemical dependent. You grow the organic adapted varieties under organic conditions and they do really well. So that's what we're finding. In farmers markets, if you see vegetables there that we didn't see 10 years ago, more often than not, it's an organic variety that's been found to be better for growing organics. And that's the really, I think, more important change that we've seen.
Bob, did you have other local examples around seed saving and biodiversity initiatives that you wanted to share?
Yeah, I wanted to share an example of the food bank garden. I think you had Siobhan here talking about the Cambridge Self-Help Food Bank, but we've had some partnerships with the garden, the food bank garden, which is it's in Cambridge. And one of the things we have to do when we're saving seeds is we have to save seeds from a whole bunch of plants. So imagine I'm growing some tomato plants and I want to get the seeds. Okay, I can't just take seeds out of one tomato because there's a little bit of a genetic difference between the different plants. They all might look the same, but just because they look the same doesn't mean they are. There will be little differences in their sort of how they cope with diseases or how they cope with drought or just sort of invisible differences that are really important to capture. So if I'm going to capture all those genetics of that variety of tomatoes, I have to take some seeds from basically a tomato from every plant, and I have to grow a bunch of plants, like at least 20, maybe 25 or 30, and just take seeds out of some tomatoes from every one of those plants. Now, I don't need a lot of seeds. Okay, if I took all the seeds out of all the tomatoes from those 25 plants, I'd have way too many seeds. Basically, I just want to get one tomato from each plant, take the seeds, then I have a nice diverse genetic sample of that variety, and I've got enough seeds. But every tomato plant is making 10 or 12 tomatoes. So there are, like a dozen tomatoes on every plant that I don't need, but I have to grow the plant to maturity to get my seeds. So what do I do with all these extra tomatoes? I grow them at a food bank garden. And the food bank gets, 9 out of 10 of the tomatoes that I have to grow anyway. So it's been a wonderful way to do this sort of thing. And everybody benefits because I have to grow these plants anyway. So I'm just basically giving free food to the food bank that's surplus to me. I don't want to rent land to do this because we're a small not-for-profit, but they'll let me use that land for free because I'm essentially growing stuff for the food banks. It's a beautiful partnership.
Amazing. Yeah, that's great. And in terms of, you said there's about 1,000 growers that Seeds of Diversity is connected with. Are many of those local growers?
Yeah, we have growers all across the country. It's spread out. So, we have probably 5 or 6 of them in the Kitchener-Waterloo area, and if you go a little further in Southern Ontario, probably a quarter of our growers are in Southern Ontario. Obviously, they're going to be concentrated in the areas of the country where we grow more vegetables and where it's more easy. So we don't have so many in the north, although you can grow vegetables really, really well in the far north because the sun shines for all day. You get 20 or more hours of sunlight, you can grow vegetables really fast, even though the season's short. So we encourage that. But yeah, a lot of our local activity in Southern Ontario is centered around outside of the GTA. In fact, it's in this sort of smaller cities and towns.
It's been really inspiring to hear both the seed end of things as well as the youth engagement and school end of things. So I think it's really, been a beautiful contribution to the knowledge that we're accumulating here around local initiatives and broader significance. So I really appreciate the time that both of you put in today. And Allison, I'm keen to follow up with you in terms of roundtable youth engagement as well. So thank you again, and really appreciate your time.
Well, thanks everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome.